Early one crisp morning, John decided to take a walk through the dense forest near his cabin. The air was fresh, and the leaves underfoot crunched softly as he made his way through the trees. His cabin, situated on the edge of the woods, was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the hustle and bustle of the outside world. But today, something was different. As he walked, a strange sound broke the peaceful silence. An eerie, almost otherworldly howl echoed through the trees. Curious, John stopped in his tracks and listened carefully. The howl was unmistakable. It came from a wolf, or so he thought. His heart raced as he wondered what could be happening out there in the forest. With a quiet breath, he set down his camping gear, his instincts telling him something was off. He moved closer to the source of the howl, his eyes scanning the dense foliage for any sign of movement. The forest, usually peaceful, now felt charged with tension. As he approached a small clearing, John spotted the wolf. It was unlike any wolf he'd seen before. This was no wild animal simply roaming the woods. This wolf was trapped. It was a massive creature, its fur matted and its body strained, trying desperately to free itself from a snare. The wolf's legs were caught in a metal trap, and it was clear that it had been struggling for some time. John could see the exhaustion in its eyes, a mixture of pain and surrender. The animal seemed to have lost the fight, now lying still as if it had given up. Shocked, John stood frozen, his mind racing. He knew that wolves were territorial and wild, and that approaching one could be dangerous. But seeing an animal in pain stirred something deep inside him. He couldn't just walk away. But as he took a cautious step forward, the wolf reacted instantly. It growled softly, its hackles raised, warning him to stay back. John hesitated, unsure of what to do. He didn't want to risk getting bitten or hurt, but the sight of the wounded creature filled him with a deep sense of compassion. With each step he took, the wolf's growl grew louder, more intense. The animal's eyes locked onto his, a mixture of fear and aggression. But there was also something else, something that made John pause. The wolf's fur around her belly was swollen, and John's eyes widened when he realized the truth. She was a mother. Her teats were swollen with milk, and in that moment, John knew that there must be pups somewhere nearby. If he didn't help her, those pups wouldn't survive. His heart ached at the thought of innocent young wolves left to fend for themselves in the wild, without their mother. He couldn't let that happen. John knew that in order to save the pups, he needed to save their mother first. But how could he do that without risking his own safety? The wolf was in pain and clearly terrified. One wrong move, and she could lash out in defense. Still, the thought of leaving her to die in the trap was unbearable. As he watched the wolf's eyes, John took a deep breath and gathered his courage. He wasn't someone who gave up easily. He had dealt with challenging situations throughout his life, especially during his time in the Canadian Forces, where survival instincts were a daily necessity. This moment was no different. He had the skills, the knowledge, and the determination to help. He couldn't just walk away from the situation. John slowly crouched down, trying to make himself less threatening to the wolf. He knew he had to act quickly. The longer he waited, the greater the risk to both the wolf and her pups. With his hands shaking slightly, he reached for the metal trap, hoping he could release it without causing further injury to the creature. As he touched the trap's mechanism, the wolf growled again, a low, warning sound. She bared her teeth, clearly desperate and scared. But John continued. His mind raced as he tried to figure out the best way to proceed. He could see that the trap was stuck, likely due to the wolf's frantic movements. John needed to be careful, yet quick. If he couldn't get the trap open soon, the wolf might bleed out from the injuries on her leg. He couldn't let that happen. He gently touched her paw, trying to reassure her with a soft voice. But it was clear she wasn't ready to trust him yet. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. The tension was thick, and every movement seemed to make the wolf more agitated. John tried pressing the release button on the trap, but it wouldn't budge. His heart pounded as the seconds ticked away. The wolf's condition was worsening, and there was no time left to waste. With a surge of determination, John grabbed a nearby rock and used it to force the trap open. His hands were sweating, his fingers numb from the cold metal, but he kept working. knowing that the wolf's survival depended on him. Finally, with a sharp snap, the trap released. John breathed a sigh of relief as he gently pulled the wolf's leg free. She winced in pain, but it seemed that she was finally free. Still, the job wasn't done. John knew the wolf needed medical attention, and fast. He couldn't let her bleed out in the middle of the woods. He scooped her up as gently as possible and began the long trek back to his cabin, where he had the medical supplies to tend to her wounds. The journey back was slow, taking nearly an hour, but John didn't mind. He was determined to help her. After all, her life, and the lives of her pups, were in his hands now. When John finally reached his cabin with the wounded wolf in his arms, he was exhausted, but relief washed over him as he gently laid her down beside the fireplace. The warmth of the cabin's interior began to work its magic, and he could see her body relax, slowly beginning to heal. The wolf's fur was still damp from the cold, and her breathing was shallow, but she was alive. He had saved her life. He carefully tended to her injuries, cleaning and dressing the wound on her leg, hoping it wasn't too severe to heal. As he worked, he couldn't shake the thought of the wolf's pups. They were still out there somewhere, and they needed their mother. Once he had done everything he could for the wolf, John made up his mind. He couldn't rest until he found the pups and reunited them with their mother. He knew the forest well, having lived near it for years, and he knew that wolves rarely left their young behind. The fact that this wolf had been trapped while nursing meant that her pups were close by. John wasn't going to waste any more time. He needed to act fast. He grabbed his survival gear and headed back out into the forest, scanning the trees and underbrush for any sign of the pups. The search wasn't going to be easy. Wolves were instinctively protective of their young, and their dens were often hidden in the most unlikely places. Still, John knew he had to try. He had trained for situations like this, using every skill he had learned during his time with the Canadian Forces. His eyes were sharp, and his instincts told him to follow the trail further into the woods. As he ventured deeper into the forest, John kept his senses alert. Every crackling leaf, every rustling branch was a potential clue. The forest was eerily quiet, as though it too understood the gravity of the situation. The only sound was the crunch of his boots on the frozen ground and the occasional distant call of a bird. It was then that John noticed something. A slight indentation in the snow near a cluster of trees. It was barely noticeable, but he had been trained to spot the smallest of signs. He knelt down to inspect it more closely. A hole, small but noticeable, appeared beneath a thick layer of snow. It was the kind of hole that might lead to a den, a place where the wolf's pups could be hiding. His heart raced as he examined the area more carefully, looking for any signs of life. He didn't know for sure if this was the den, but it seemed like the most promising lead so far. Taking a deep breath, John carefully approached the hole. The forest was still, and the wind had died down, leaving only the sound of his breathing and the soft whisper of his clothing as he moved. He could feel the presence of something nearby, an animal, perhaps. Then, out of the silence, came a faint whimper. It was barely audible, but it was there. John froze, his heart skipping a beat. The sound came again, louder this time, definitely the whimper of a pup. His eyes widened with hope as he realized that the den was close, and that the pups were still alive. With a quiet urgency, John dropped to his knees and began carefully digging through the snow and leaves. His heart pounded as he worked faster, pulling aside the damp earth, determined not to let time slip away. After several minutes, he finally uncovered the entrance to the den, and as he peered inside, his eyes were met with 4 small, trembling wolf pups. They were huddled together, their fur matted and their bodies weak from hunger and cold. The sight of the pups filled John with a mixture of relief and urgency. He gently reached into the den and carefully pulled them out one by one, cradling them in his arms. They were tiny and fragile, their eyes barely open, and their whimpers only grew louder as they sensed his presence. John could feel their desperation. They were hungry, scared, and confused, but they were alive, against all odds. They had survived. He knew he had to get them back to their mother as quickly as possible. The journey back to the cabin was slow and methodical. As John carefully carried the pups in a small bag he had brought with him, he made sure to keep them warm, wrapping them in his jacket as best as he could. The air was bitterly cold, and every step felt like an eternity, but he couldn't afford to stop. He had to get them to their mother. He had made a promise to her, and to the pups, that he would not let them down. By the time he returned to the cabin, the wolf had begun to stir. She was alert now, her eyes flickering open as she noticed John entering the cabin with her pups. There was a brief moment of hesitation as the wolf watched him, her body tense and cautious. But then, as though she recognized the scent of her young, she let out a soft whimper. John carefully set the pups down on the floor, watching as they immediately scrambled toward their mother. The wolf's eyes softened, and she gently nuzzled each of her pups, licking them tenderly, as though to reassure them that everything would be okay. The moment was heartwarming, and for John, it was a moment of pure triumph. He had saved a family, and now they were whole again. But the work wasn't over yet. As he watched the wolf and her pups, he knew that he still had to be vigilant. There were dangers out there in the forest, other predators, the harsh weather, and the constant struggle to survive. But for now, in that small cabin, John felt a deep sense of peace. The wolf and her pups were safe, and that was all that mattered. However, the sense of relief was short-lived. Over the next few days, John began to notice something that he hadn't anticipated. The wolf, who had been recovering from her injuries, was acting strangely. She was restless, and whenever she went outside, she returned with more wolves, more members of her pack. John could feel the tension rising, and as the days passed, it became clear that the situation was far from over. Something was brewing, and John wasn't sure what to expect next. He only knew that the forest had more surprises in store for him. The days following John's rescue of the wolf and her pups were filled with a sense of quiet accomplishment. He had done what few would dare attempt. He had saved a wild animal, not only by freeing her from a trap, but by bringing her pups back to her. The wolf, whom he had come to call Luna, was recovering steadily, and her pups, 4 in total, were thriving under her care. It was a peaceful sight to see them all together in the warmth of his cabin, nestled near the fireplace, safe from the bitter cold of the forest outside. However, John knew that the story was far from over. Every night, the winds howled through the trees surrounding his cabin, but the howls he had heard on that fateful morning had been replaced by an unsettling silence. The forest, once alive with the sounds of animals, felt tense, as though it were holding its breath. And then, one evening, as John sat by the fire, the silence was broken. A soft whimpering sound echoed from outside the cabin, followed by the unmistakable sound of paws padding through the snow. Startled, John stood up and cautiously approached the door. Through the frosted window, he could just make out the figures of several large wolves, their eyes gleaming in the dim light. Luna, still lying by the fire, had heard them too. Her ears perked up, and she let out a low growl, warning the intruders to stay away. But John knew that these wolves weren't ordinary predators. They were her family. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. Luna's pack had arrived, and they were looking for her. The first wolf to step closer to the door was massive, its fur thick and its posture dominant. John recognized the leader of the pack, the alpha male. He was a proud creature, his coat gleaming under the moonlight. The other wolves circled around, watching the cabin with caution, their eyes fixed on Luna. John took a deep breath and stepped back, not wanting to provoke the pack. He knew that wolves, especially in a situation like this, could be unpredictable. Luna growled again, but this time, her tone was different. It wasn't a warning, it was a call. She stood up slowly, her legs still weak but growing stronger with each passing day. As if in response to her call, the alpha male's stance softened. The other wolves relaxed their posture, though they remained close by, their eyes never leaving Luna and her pups. The tension in the air was palpable, and John could feel his heart racing in his chest. For a moment, there was silence as both sides observed one another. Luna looked at her pups, who were now growing bolder and more energetic. They yipped and ran around her, playfully tugging at her fur. Unaware of the significance of the moment, John stepped back, unsure of what was to come. Would the pack accept him? Would they see him as a threat or a protector? His mind raced with questions, but all he could do was watch and wait. The alpha male took a step forward. His eyes locked on Luna. Slowly, Luna limped towards him, and for the first time, John saw the delicate bond between them. The wolf's tail wagged gently, and she nuzzled the alpha male as though to confirm her place in the pack. The moment was a beautiful display of wild, untamed loyalty, and John stood in awe of the scene unfolding before him. Then, something unexpected happened. The alpha male sniffed the air, his eyes darting toward John. A low growl escaped his throat, a sound that sent a shiver down John's spine. The rest of the pack seemed to tense, and for a brief second, John thought the situation might escalate into something dangerous. But before he could react, Luna stepped between him and the alpha male, her body stiff and protective. She turned to face John, her eyes locking onto his with a sense of understanding. It was clear now, Luna had accepted him. She had recognized that he had saved her life and the lives of her pups. John let out a slow breath, realizing that this was a moment of trust. The wolves had been watching him, and while they were wary of him, they knew that Luna had found an ally in the human who had risked everything to save her. Over the next few days, John kept his distance, allowing Luna and her pack to adjust to their new surroundings. The wolves would come and go, but always with the knowledge that their mother and pups were safe. As the days passed, the relationship between John and the wolves grew more complicated. He could never fully let his guard down, knowing that the wild instincts of the pack could turn against him if he was perceived as a threat. Yet, he also felt a deep connection to Luna and her family, a connection that was rooted in respect and mutual understanding. One morning, John woke to the sound of Luna barking, a sharp, commanding call that echoed through the cabin. He rushed outside to find the entire pack gathered at the edge of the forest, looking outward as if sensing something was wrong. His heart skipped a beat as he saw movement in the distance, a group of hunters, armed with rifles, moving through the trees. The situation had just become critical. John knew that the pack would not stand a chance against the hunters. They were skilled, and they were hunting for sport. He had to act quickly. Without thinking, he grabbed his rifle and rushed out into the snow, his mind set on one goal: protecting Luna and her family at all costs. The next few hours were a blur of motion. John made his way through the forest, using his knowledge of the terrain to keep the hunters at bay. He used every trick he knew to distract them, drawing them away from the wolves. It wasn't easy. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but his determination was stronger than any fear. He had already saved these wolves once, and he would do it again. Finally, after hours of dodging the hunters, John was able to lead them away from the wolves. The pack was safe, for now. Luna and her pups would have a chance to survive, and John had earned the respect of the entire pack. As he made his way back to the cabin, he knew that his life had changed forever. He wasn't just a man living in the wilderness. He was part of something much larger. He had become a protector, a guardian, of the wolves. And from that day forward, John knew that he would never be alone. The wolves, his unlikely family, would always be watching over him, just as he had watched over them. The bond they shared was unspoken, but it was real, and it would last a lifetime.